Today we'll be looking at the impact of Stalin's rule, which is the second part of Chapter 2, Stalin's Soviet Union. Previously we looked at the reasons for Stalin's rise to power, and as you know, he eventually rose to become the supreme leader of the Soviet Union in 1929. But following that, we remember that he had a dictatorship, right? So a leadership whereby he did not tolerate any dissent, and there were no other people whom the Soviet people could choose to have as leader rather than him. Alright, and the general perception of Stalin's rule is that it was one which was a negative one overall, okay, that it devastated the Soviet Union. But we want to ask ourselves, is that truly the case? Because yes, there were a lot of devastating impacts, but there also were positive things. Okay, so this is why our question when we look at the impact of Stalin's rule is, to what extent did Stalin's dictatorship devastate the Soviet Union? And we'll be doing so by looking at three particular areas. Firstly, we'll look at the economic impact. In other words, the financial life, how money was like, the financial situation of the country. How was it? What was the impact of Stalin's rule on this? Then we'll be looking at basically his rule, the political impact. How strong was his rule? Okay, at this point in time, and what was how were things like in terms of how he controlled the people? And finally, we'll look at more specifically the impact of the people, or the impact on the people themselves of Stalin's rule. Okay, so we're going to look at these one by one, starting off with the economic impact, which was one where, typically speaking, we can, to sum it up in one word, it was modernization. Alright, so his economic aims were to modernize the USSR in order to catch up to the economic and military levels of the West, the Western powers. Remember that Stalin and the communism in general, the ideology of communism was one which was very much opposed by the Western powers. And Stalin, by the time he came to power, he realized that the USSR was still rather backward, and so he therefore wanted to modernize it to catch up to the level of his ideological rivals, okay, basically the Western powers such as the US, Britain, so on and so forth. So he attempted to achieve these aims through a series of what we call 5-year plans. So he set targets for within 5 years how the production levels of the country were to be, the economy, how was it to be in 5 years time, and then he put measures in place to reach there. So these were called 5-year plans. Now they set targets for industrial development, that means development in the cities, okay, building up of factories through a process called rapid industrialization, as well as in the countryside, okay, agriculture development through something called collectivization. If you recall previously, during the time before the communists came to power, there were as many as 95% of the Russian population which were peasants, and now Stalin wanted to develop the countryside so that there's no need for so many people, such a huge proportion of the people, to be in the countryside and move them to the cities. Okay, and so these were targets which were set in order to achieve these aims of Stalin. Right, so let's first take a look at collectivization. So this is the idea behind it. Mechanization and larger farm sizes would make farming more efficient, and so Stalin went about the process of merging many small individual farms into larger collective farms. Okay, so previously farms were owned by individual small owners, okay, many small ones, and Stalin wanted to merge them, confiscate them, so to speak, from those individual owners, individual farmers, and group them into larger collective farms. That's why it's called collectivization. Okay, so you can see here a picture of how a farm in the Soviet Union, and you can see some kind of equipment there, right? Mechanization. This is what Stalin wanted. So he took over ownership from these farms, as what I was saying, from these individual farmers. These farmers were known as the kulaks. Okay, they were known as the kulaks, and basically the state, which means the government, determined working hours, wages, and production levels. So now the state, the government, was boss, no longer these individual farmers in charge of their own small plot of land. Now they have to give it over to the government, to the state. And on their own, as compared to before, unlike before, they were no longer allowed to sell food on their own. And there also were severe punishments for farmers who did not meet production targets or were absent from their work. So if you look at this, imagine if you were a farmer, you'll see that there's a huge change from how things were like before. Okay. Now the aim of this was to help the USSR industrialize rapidly, because that's what I was saying earlier. You can see for yourself. Now, if farms are mechanized, then you do not need so much manual labor in the farms, as much as 95% of the people, right? So now, if there's mechanization, the machines can do the work of some of the people, and therefore some of these farmers would be able to move to the cities and work in factories instead. Because remember, factories were important to help industrialize the country, industrialize them rapidly, which is what Stalin wanted. Okay. At the same time, mechanization, in theory at least, would help to ensure that there's a secure food supply for the factory workers, so that basically the farms will be productive enough to feed the factory workers and any exports, because the hope was that there will be surplus. Okay, in other words, there will be enough food to feed the people, and so any extra food which they grow then could be exported. Remember, when you export things, you gain money, right? As opposed to when you import, you lose money because you're buying from other countries. When you export, you are selling to other countries. So Stalin hoped that profits from these exports would fund industrialization. It would help, it will in the end go back to industrialization. Now, as I was saying just now, imagine if you're a farmer, there'll be lots of changes, and these were typically changes which are not very popular among many of them, in particular the kulaks. Okay, and in fact they were so unhappy that they resisted collectivization by killing their own farm animals and even burning their grain to prevent the state from taking them. Alright, so they were really very serious, very stubborn in their opposition to collectivization. So due to this, there was very strict enforcement. If you already know anything you know about Stalin, one thing you know about him is that he's a very stubborn man as well, a very firm man, and he wants to be in control. So if people oppose him, he will take action. So what type of action? Those who resisted collectivization were shot or even sent to forced labor camps. Alright? And in fact, he also basically there was a severe famine between the years 32 to 34, okay, whereby millions died from starvation. And this actually is linked to strict enforcement. In what way? Because, okay, you can see here this American headline, American newspaper headline, 6 million perish. That's a huge number. That's even more than Singapore's entire population. Alright? Because was this famine man-made? Because you can see here that instead of distributing stored grain, so there was grain around, there was food, okay, for the starving people, but Stalin chose to export the grain to raise funds to buy machinery needed for industrialization. In other words, Stalin's priority here was industrialization rather than feeding his own starving people, many of whom perhaps were not very enthusiastic about collectivization to begin with. So maybe that contributed to why he felt it was not that big of a deal, right? And basically it was more worth it to industrialize the country. Now, so I want you to think on your own whether you think that this decision can be justified. In other words, is there any way that we can say, yes, Stalin did the right thing by doing this? Okay, can we justify what he said, or what he did, excuse me, or is it something which cannot be approved of, it cannot be condoned? Okay, so I want you to write this at your own time in your handout. So now we will look at the impacts of modernization on the industries. Okay, something called rapid industrialization. So this was in the urban areas. Early on we learned about the impact of modernization on the countryside through collectivization. Now we see how collectivization helped in turn to ensure or help to promote, to facilitate rapid industrialization. Let's look at how this worked through the first 5-year plan, which was implemented, the first of Stalin's 5-year plans. This was implemented just shortly before Stalin became the overall unchallenged supreme leader of the Soviet Union. Okay, we recall what I talked about 5-year plans earlier. Basically, targets were set of what was to be achieved in 5 years' time, and then plans were put in place, processes were put in place in order to get there. And this is a flowchart of how it works in summary. Firstly, as what we said earlier, modern machines were introduced in farms, and this means that theoretically, if this means that more grain is produced than before, there would be increased food produced to supply the people working in the cities, in the factories, and this would give them the energy and the morale, okay, to work very hard and produce lots of farming machinery, which in turn could be brought back to the farm. So it's supposed to be a cycle, positive cycle, whereby agricultural mechanization would help the factories as well, and it in turn would go back to help the farms once again. Now, at this time, propaganda campaigns were also put in place to urge workers to work harder and more efficiently. Remember, Stalin wanted as much to be produced as possible. This was all part of his 5-year plan target, a very quantitative target, which means in terms of quantity, amount. Now, there were certain groups of people called shock workers. These were those who were deemed to have exceeded their given target. So each worker was given a target, and those which were seen to have gone far beyond their targets were honored and were given higher pay. Okay, and this was meant to serve as a motivation to others. Okay, I will share with you a link to a video which talks a bit more about this later on. Now, those who did not work hard enough or did not meet their targets were of course punished. Now, no surprise here, similar to what we talked about earlier in terms of in the countryside. For those who resisted collectivization or did not meet their farming targets, the same would have excuse me, applied to the workers in the factories. Now, moving on to the second and third 5-year plans, the focus was very squarely, very much on heavy industries such as coal, steel and oil. Okay, here is a picture of the city of Magnitogorsk, which was you can see the scale of architecture of how big this factory is. Okay, so this was an industrial city set up for the purpose of developing the Soviet heavy industries further. Okay, by the end of the 1930s, towards the third 5-year plan, emphasis was also placed on preparing the USSR for, if you see here, there's a clue, can you see here, these are tanks? So this was preparing the USSR for war, alright? Because remember, the USSR had many enemies and Stalin wanted to be prepared to deal with them, if need be. Now, I'll show you another link here to a video. It's embedded here, but I won't play it here, so I'll just show you the link later on. But this is basically talking more about the impact of collectivization and whether you can see overall your verdict, whether it would be one where it was positive or negative. Was it beneficial overall, or were the costs too much to justify the benefits? So let's do a quick summary, a quick checklist to look at the 5-year plans and whether they were successful or not. So let's look at a few results of it. All these are facts. Okay, the USSR was transformed from a backward country, a very weak, undeveloped country, into one which was a great industrialized nation by the end of the 1930s. So you can say, yes, in this case it was a positive impact. Okay, however, you can see there, fall in standards of living, very bad working conditions and living conditions, and people were pushed very hard to achieve targets. So not as positive. Other things, okay, I'm sure all of you would not like your personal freedom to be restricted by too much, but this was how things were like, even for workers. This is not even for students of your age, but for workers as well, their personal freedoms were restricted, and they were not allowed to move much. Okay, in other words, moving out of cities or things like that. Okay, so very strict control. Consumer industries, that means everyday goods, things which you and I would buy, things like basic food items or maybe clothing, things like that, furniture. There was little growth in these industries because the focus was on the heavy industries. Okay, even basic goods such as simple food, staple food like bread were rationed. So again, not the most positive of impacts. There also was poor planning and coordination of production. This means that due to the scale, the size of the Soviet Union, there's a lot of coordination which needs to be done in order to produce what needed to be produced efficiently and effectively, but this was not done. Alright, and because as what I said earlier, the focus for Stalin was on quantitative Okay, quantitative, in other words, in terms of how much was produced rather than how good those things produced were. So the hurry to meet the production figures and to produce, let's say, X amount of things means that the quality of this X amount tended to be very low. Alright, so overall, ask yourself, okay, do you think that you can, based on all this, you would say that the 5-year plans were successful? Now here is a graph to show you more about the impact of the first and second 5-year plans. You can see here for yourself what each of these colors represent in terms of these bars. Basically, to cut a long story short, what you see in the first, third and fifth, that means the blue, purple and red bars, is to do with the actual production levels, and the orange and green bars refer to the targets. This is the target of the first 5-year plan, and this is the target of the second 5-year plan, and you can see whether in each case whether the targets were reached or not. Okay, and so I want to ask you these questions. 1932, Stalin announced that the first 5-year plan was a great success, not just a success but a great success. So I want you to look at this, okay, and answer this question in terms of between the orange, which was what was planned, and the purple, which was what was achieved. Would you call this to be a great success in the first 5-year plan? Okay, how true was this announcement? Right, I want you to think about that. Okay, now secondly, I want you to answer this question. Do you think that these production targets were even realistic to begin with? So look at the orange bar and the green bar. Do you think, based on what you see here, especially in terms of what actually was produced, whether these targets were realistic? Right, and this is something for you to think about. Right, I also want you to think about why was it that Stalin would announce that these plans were a great success to begin with. Okay, think about that.